In this podcast, we're going to be taking a little bit of an interesting look at the showdown between Pewdiepie and T Series. Now, for this, we need to first exactly look at who T Series is. They're actually under the original name, which is Super Cassettes Industries Private Limited. They're doing business as the name T Series. And if we look at a little bit of their history, they originally started selling pirated Bollywood songs. So they're not exactly the most reputable company to begin with, um, because they're selling pirated music to begin with back in the 1980s. Um, they have a multi-channel network, and YouTube team consists of 13 people. The T Series HQ on the YouTube. And basically is what we see first is we see that basically is their viewership and subscriber totals aren't exactly equaling out. This is one thing that should be a little bit suspect to begin with. Number one is usually there's some type of amount there. And number two is what we're seeing with it is when it comes down to it is what their business really is. Is if we go down to actually what they actually do is they the actual business controls is the largest music record label in India, controlling about 35% share of the Indian music market. Now, the way music technically is usually spread across the globe, especially nowadays, even in Asia, is they usually tab that with cell phone plans. And that would specifically go with why we're seeing such high subscriber amounts. Not necessarily that people are naturally subscribing, but they're actually getting it auto subscribed through YouTube through actually cell phone plans when they subscribe, which would be why they're. If you look at the population of India compared to the T Series subscription amounts, you see that the actual number here subscribes at about 16 to 1, which should be about where they're getting at cell phone subscriptions and people actually being retained for the actual subscriptions themselves. Because when it comes to the actual viewership, is we're not seeing, when it comes to the actual views, it's we're not seeing enough views on a lot of these videos in comparison to what they really should be, compared to what we're seeing with such people as PewDiePie. PewDiePie is killing them in views for time being up with it, because I mean this one came out 6 days ago and it doesn't even have 50,000 views, and something that PewDiePie would put up that long ago would have a greater number of views than that, and that's easily surpassed. And especially if you have over 85 million viewers, you should be able to snag at least somewhere close to, even if you're just getting 1% of your viewers, you should be able to at least get over 800,000 views on that. And yet they're not getting that. They're getting these numbers that are much lower, and it's only on certain specific ones that they're getting that it seems like they're getting these hot numbers. And those must be on very, very popular songs that they have. And that seems to be the case. It's only on rare occasions that they're getting 1 million plus on actual videos. And if you look at the politics of India, that might be why with it. Where they're located in the south end of this conservative area in India. You'll see me highlighting it right here with my mouse. Now, what's key with this is the BJP is a conservative party. Now, they control this. There's also a coalition here, what I'm highlighting right now, which is going to be a coalition with this conservative, which just controls this area and a couple small areas up here. The red down here is basically other parties. You see the gold area down here is also conservative. But what we see here with this, what we call mint green, this is a coalition with the INC, the Indian National Congress, and this all blue area all through here is the Indian National Congress, a huge area there, which is a huge population. Now, if we look at this, we can easily state that this is a big area. Now, the major problem with this is this isn't exactly a capitalist area. This is all socialist. This area down here and this area up here is all socialist. While these areas here around it are capitalist, this area here and this area down here are all socialist. And if we look at this rate of about 16-1, it's not hard to see that you could essentially say it's not hard to enforce it. The way to escape the actual penalties of the high taxation is to be just outside of that area where your headquarters are, which is exactly where they are. Now, this is where we're actually getting to something quite interesting, which is one of the points that's actually made to be, which is, do we have a point where it is plausible that they could actually have it, where this would essentially be enforced for them to do it? They had that 35% share, which is most likely through phones, followed by Sony Music India and then Z Music. We see that basically they rise out of virtually nothing, which means they had to have come up through a phone subscription service. We see that they rise out of nowhere for YouTube, which means they must have had this through YouTube itself. Their content is out of Hindi, Urdu, and Punjab language, while they also have other languages as well. And yet they've kind of basically they've been quite questionable since then. The initial chairman was initially head of it, yet he was technically murdered by the Mumbai Mafia Syndicate. Now, this should be what we call a little bit questionable if he's making people angry, if the initial head of it, and then it was been led by his son and his younger brother. And this should be a little bit questionable of how this everything came about. If this is happening, this means that something fishy is going on. If we're seeing people being killed by a mafia syndicate within this company. Now, this doesn't happen normally with normal quality upstanding companies that are doing this. This means to keep their share, they're essentially dealing with people that are not exactly the most upholding and upstanding individuals. And they're essentially doing it through working with less than upstanding individuals. Now, if we look at here, we see what is a definition of why socialism being forced, which would essentially explain why they're actually using this specific area. And this is by Milton Friedman.
Has socialism failed because its good qualities were perverted by evil men who got in charge? Was it simply because Stalin took over from Lenin? that communism went the way it did? Has capitalism succeeded despite the immoral values that pervade it? I think the answer to both questions is in the negative. The results have arisen because each system has been true to its own values. Or rather, a system doesn't have values, I don't mean that, has been true to the values it encourages, supports, and develops in the people who live under that system. What we're concerned with in discussing moral values here are those that have to do with the relations between people. It's important to distinguish between two sets of moral considerations. The morality that is relevant to each of us in our private life, how we each individually conduct ourselves, behave. And then what's relevant to systems of government and organization are the relations between people. And in judging relations between people, I do not believe that the fundamental value is to do good to others, whether they want you to or not. The fundamental value is not to do good to others as you see their good. It's not to force them to do good. As I see it, the fundamental value in relations among people is to respect the dignity and the individuality of fellow men. To treat your fellow man not as an object to be manipulated for your purpose, but to treat him as a person with his own values and his own rights, a person to be persuaded, not coerced, not forced, not bulldozed, not brainwashed. That seems to me to be a fundamental value in social relations. Whenever we depart from voluntary cooperation and try to do good by using force, the bad moral value of force triumphs over good intentions. And you realize this is highly relevant to what I am saying, because the essential notion of a capitalist society, which I'll come back to, is voluntary cooperation, voluntary exchange. The essential notion of a socialist society is fundamentally force. If the government is the master, if society is to be run from the center, what are you doing? You ultimately have to order people what to do. What is your ultimate sanction? Go back a ways. Take it on a milder level. Whenever you try to do good with somebody else's money, you are committed to using force. How can you do good with somebody else's money unless you first take it away from them? The only way you can take it away from them is by the threat of force. You have a policeman, a tax collector, who comes and takes it from them. This is carried much farther. If you really have a socialist society, if you have an organization from the center, if you have supposed government bureaucrats running things, that can only ultimately rest on force. But whenever you resort to force, even to try to do good, you must not question people's motives. Maybe they're evil sometime, but look at the results of what they do. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Assume their motives are good. You know, there's an old saying about the road to hell being paved with good intentions. You have to look at the outcome. And whenever you use force, the bad moral value of force triumphs over good intentions. The reason is not only that famous aphorism of Lord Acton. You all know it, you've all heard it. Absolute power corrupts. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's the whole aphorism. That's one reason why trying to do good with methods that involve force lead to bad results. Because the people who set out with good intentions are themselves corrupted. And I may add, if they're not corrupted, they're replaced by people with bad intentions, who are more efficient at getting control of the use of force. But also, the fundamental reason is more profound. The most harm of all is done when power is in the hands of people who are absolutely persuaded of the purity of their instincts, and of the purity of their intentions. Thoreau says that philanthropy is a much overrated virtue. Sincerity is also a much overrated virtue. Heaven preserve us from the sincere reformer who knows what's good for you and by heaven is going to make you do it whether you like it or not. That's when you get the greatest harm done. I have no reason to doubt that Lenin was a man whose intentions were good. Maybe they weren't. But he was completely persuaded that he was right, and he was willing to use any methods at all for the ultimate good. Again, it's interesting to contrast the experience of Hitler versus Mussolini. Mussolini was much less of a danger to human rights because he was a hypocrite. Because he didn't really believe what he was saying. He was just in there for the game. He started out as a socialist. He turned to a fascist. He was willing to be bribed by whoever would bribe him the most. As a result, there were at least some protections against his arbitrary rule. But Hitler was a sincere fanatic. He believed in what he was doing, and he did far greater harm.
See, with what we see there with it is we can see that basically is he explains that socialism is really based on force. And if we look at that, if we look at the actual physical area that's covering much of India, even though India has certain areas that are capitalist, this basically allows a capitalist country to a capitalist company to essentially exist, but essentially take advantage of a huge area that is basically socialist and can use their method of force through such methods of the cellular phone industry. And we see this when we look at the percentage. We can see that that's easily the 35% share. And that's probably how they are doing this. And they're doing this and basically using force on this whole system. And where I think we can actually do a comparison is when we see people like PewDiePie. PewDiePie is not using force. He's using just a voluntary system and actually using his content to lure people in naturally, and that's how he's getting people in. He's not using force and trying to essentially auto-sign people in to his system to force them on to generate income, such as what T-Series is likely doing. Because if T-Series was essentially starting out selling pirated Bollywood songs, we know the likelihood is they're likely trying to cheat the system and cheat the advertising revenue system as well by doing this, because they know the more people they can get on and even just clicking on the thing just on random, we know that by putting up videos, we know that they can essentially create much more ad revenue as well. And we know that that's essentially going to be their goal, is to try and become the biggest station that's on YouTube, the biggest channel, and that's their sole goal. Whereas PewDiePie's only goal is for the actual personal goal of gaining more subscribers to show his personal acceptance amongst a larger crowd beyond just gamers themselves. And there's a total different connection between it. One is more about dominance, where the other one is actually about the capitalist growth of an actual channel from being small to the actual larger. This is that it's an actual corporate entity. It started that way before it actually came into YouTube itself. With PewDiePie came in with nothing when he started this. That's the whole big difference. And that's what people need to understand with the difference between the two. This is the guy this is the thing that started with selling pirated songs and became a corporate entity. Essentially what looks like they were working with the Mumbai Mafia Syndicate, D Company, which is an organized criminal syndicate linked with the movement of drugs, extortion, murder, drug trafficking, terrorism, even the '93 Mumbai bombings. And it seems like they've been somehow linked with them, including having 3 of the people on the FBI's 10 most wanted list in the past. So we're talking that when it comes down to it, is there's a definite disconnect between these two groups. And this, I think it's less of a conspiracy theory and more of, when we look at it, it's plausible. Because when we're talking about a 16-1, that's we're talking, it's roughly about 5%. And when we're talking, basically, they would only need to have about a 14% retention of their market share to be retained onto YouTube, which is not hard to do for any person, for any company. If you look at record companies, when they sell products with it, they should be able to retain somewhere at least that, if not higher, of their actual followers and people who are interested in their product. If you go from one social media entity to the next, they should be able to have at least that amount. So when it looks like that, I would say this does look as a plausible thing. Now, I wouldn't say necessarily that, I don't know necessarily if YouTube is working necessarily with them, but I would say that that due to business interests outside of the country, that they're turning a blind eye to it, as they have with some of the situations with the what they've done with what some of the stuff Google has done to change around their algorithms for China, when they created a special system for China just for that case. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that they're more interested in developing these systems for these other countries for the business purposes, rather than actually looking into the actual practices that these places are doing. And I think this is something where something like T-Series needs to be really investigated, because some of their background, if you look at their company itself, is quite shady to begin with. Starting out selling pirated songs, the actual links with a terrorist linked mafia that murdered murdered the founder, which shows a potential link there, that they had some type of links there. There's a very high rise in the number of subscribers, yet the number of views don't correspond. So this is where the whole problem is coming from. And then all of a sudden, it's originally founded by a juice seller that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, becomes this business owner. That means that he's working with this mafia to actually rise. And that's the whole point. That we need to realize that this is where this whole thing comes from. That we need to understand that that this is where this whole thing is coming from, and that it's potentially questionable at best. And we're looking at a company that's basically and it even for what it called, for essentially, and it even T-Series, with it back in 2007, was even filing lawsuits against YouTube. So I mean, they're questionable at best. So they seem to be wanting to leech money out of the system. So they seem to be less than reputable. If I were YouTube, I tend to want to look into investigating them. This is at least my opinion from a business aspect, as the idea of a public administration degree, a master's degree, would has a lot of the business aspects. It just goes into the public aspects as well. And I'm very, very questionable on their rise, because it just seems way too fast to rise out of nowhere. And it just seems that something seems to be a little bit fishy. Now, if you like this video, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, share this with all your friends on social media, share with everybody public, and get everybody to subscribe to my channel as possible, and see if you can get everybody as possible to subscribe to Pewdiepie and unsubscribe from T-Series, because something definitely fishy is going on there. And I will see you guys most likely tomorrow. Bye, everyone.